Yay me, I remembered to do it. Woot, woot. Okie dokie. How's everybody? I see some new faces. I see some familiar faces. I'm getting great feedback off of this class series.
This is awesome, Lori.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So what I think I'm going to do, we are, just so you can plan your schedules, we are going to bleed over to Monday. So plan Monday morning and we'll do our wrap up because no matter how fast I talk, which I talk pretty fast, there's so much and we're really just hitting the major forms. So after that, I'm going to take a break. I'm going to go to R4, take a little time off after that. And then when I get back mid-March, I think I will start this up again and maybe just do like a couple in a week just to hit, like, we'll start hitting the ancillary forms. The ones that you're going to use just so you know they're there. And I mean, because half the time I'll get a call and somebody will ask me for some verbiage and I'll say, did you know there's a form for that? Because God Love Our Multiple has pretty much made forms for everything. So half the battle is just knowing in the back of your brain that it's there, and then knowing at least one word to be able to go into your search field with your asterisks, your wildcard, asterisk word, asterisk, and then hopefully it'll come up. That's my hint. I do it all the time. And knowing the manuals. So we covered inspections on, what day is it? We covered inspections on Monday. And part of what I'm doing is I call it the 100-mile view. Because even though it seems like we're taking a lot of time and doing deep dives, there's still so much more. So hopefully everybody, and if you haven't, please go back and do it, is going back and pulling up the manual on these forms that we're going through. And then one of your final homework assignments is I'm going to make up a couple of story problems and have you actually fill out contracts using the appropriate forms and using your best judgment, how much earnest money, what is the closing date, the whole 9 yards, so that you can get used to, there's certain, I mean, there's a lot of things we can go online and get answers to, but then again, there's a lot of things that are not online that you just have to know. How long does it take for a septic inspection? How long does it take to get an inspection? I've got a VA loan. How much time should I allow for closing? What are the costs that the seller needs to do? These are all things that will just come with experience and knowing what to ask. And I've said it before, I'll say it again, there are no dumb questions. If you have a question on a contract, please reach out to either your team lead or Blake or me or Laura Bird or Summer or Rick Meyer or somebody, and just make double sure if you've got a question that you're filling everything out correctly. So, and you guys are pretty good about that. I always answer my phone on the weekend. Shoot me a text before you do. If you don't have my number in your phone, put it in there. 360-739-1001. Actually, I'll put it over in the chat. Kind of my rule on the weekends, I don't always monitor my email, but I always have my phone with me. So shoot me a text if you've got something you want me to review. Or if you need to talk to me, just shoot me a text. Hey, do you have time for a quick call? Or I'm going to send you an email with a contract. Please review it. And sorry, somebody's dinging out front. And we're more than happy to answer. So I'm pretty darn good about that. All right, let's get rolling. Anybody have any questions from what we've covered so far? Everybody good? Okay. My bright and shiny crew. Look at this, 33 people. Woot, woot. Today we get to do financing. So actually, you know what? I didn't pull up that I need to pull up. I need one more form. Hold on just a minute. Covered it, but I want to make sure that you get it. All right. So financing. When do you use a financing addendum? Anytime you have any kind of financing. I'm going to do a screen share here. And feel free to pop things in the message. If you've got a question, raise your hand by going to the reactions down at the bottom and doing your little hand raise thing, or just wave at me. But when I'm screen sharing, I can't see you. So just unmute by holding down your space bar and interrupt me if you would like. Okay. Financing addendum to the purchase and sale agreement. And you can see this was a fairly recent revision. This was revised in March of last year. You always go to the upper left-hand corner. That's going to tell you where it is. And by the way, just a side note, it says page 1 of 3. If you're going back and forth on a counteroffer, if I ever catch anybody just sending over the page that is being countered and not the rest of the contract, I'm going to thump you. Because that is not only is it not legal, but it's not good practice. So even though your contract may be 25 pages long and they're only making one change and it's the price on page 1, you are still going to send the entire contract back to the other party. And remember what I said about sending a link to AthenaSign showing a signed off contract. If AthenaSign or Transaction Desk goes down on the multiple, and trust me, it does, and you send a link, that will not constitute delivery. So best practice is always to download the PDF and attach that. You can send the link, that's fine, but you better darn well have your PDFs attached to it, or at least available as well. Because if it's 10 to 9 and you have a 9 o'clock deadline and the AthenaSign goes down and your clients are on the road to Yellowstone and they need to do AthenaSign and it isn't available, it is not a legal excuse. You're going to miss a deadline. And like I've said before, and I'll keep on saying it, that is the one thing, missed deadline, I cannot fix. I cannot roll back time. So here we go. Financing, this is all going to pre-fill at the top. Loan application. This is something you're going to want to cover with your buyers. The agreement is contingent on the buyer obtaining a loan, right? So back on the purchase and sale agreement at the top of page 2, if you'll remember, we say the contract says that the buyer has all the funds available for closing except for what is disclosed in this contract. So here is your disclosure that they are applying for a loan. Bonus points if anybody can tell me the other form that somebody can use to disclose they're applying for a loan. Anybody? Mute, tell me. What is it? Come on.
Evidence of funds.
Atta girl. Allison, evidence of funds. When do you use evidence of funds, Allison?
When you just want to tell them where the money's coming from. So it can be cash, contingent funds, or financing, any of those things.
But it is not contingent on that. In other words, if they're unable to procure their financing, they're going to lose their earnest money. But it's a disclosure that your buyer is getting a loan, which covers you back on that page 2 of the purchase and sale agreement, because all loans that are not currently sitting in somebody's bank account have to be disclosed or you are in breach of contract. So that's how you would do it if you've got a client that says, hey, Allison, really want this house. My financing's already lined up. I got plenty of money in the bank. I don't want to make this contingent on financing. You would use a 22EF, which is an evidence of funds. That is our, if you remember, that is our jack of all trades tool. I love that form, especially in this competitive market. If you're a buyer's agent, get familiar with that form, learn how to use it. So if you look at this, you will see there's all kinds of loans. I'm not going to go into the weeds on this. This is for you to get together with your favorite lender and have them discuss with you the various options. Conventional first is the most common. Why does it say first? Because it's in first lien position on the property. There's no other liens in front of it. A conventional second. Sometimes people get a first and a second to avoid paying mortgage insurance, to get the total loan to value down below a certain percentage. A bridge loan means that they're getting a loan on their current residence in order to purchase the new residence. There's a few lenders that do those. VA, FHA, USDA are, I call them govies because they're government insured loans. Anybody can get them except for the VA, you have to be a veteran. And side note, if you're a veteran, you can reuse your VA benefits over and over and over again. So just because somebody gets a VA loan, purchases a house 10 years ago, when they sell that house and that VA loan is paid off, they can get another VA loan purchasing a new residence. Okay. So especially down around Navy Woodby, I mean, there's a lot of veterans in our neck of the woods. Just because somebody goes VA doesn't mean they don't have money in the bank. It's a better interest rate, lower down payment, and there's a lot of advantages to it. So again, get together with your favorite lender, have them talk about the ins and outs. Home equity line of credit means that maybe they're buying an investment property, but they're pulling money out of their, let's say, primary residence with what we call a home equity loan or a home equity line of credit, and they're using that money to purchase another piece of property. Or other, the old catch-all other. Buyers shall pay. Here's your down payment amount. I do not recommend putting in a dollar amount because if there's a counter offer on the price, it's always nice to have a percentage. The percentage will fluctuate up and down with the sales price where a dollar amount remains fixed. So if somebody says, hey, Brian, I want to put 20% down, and the sales price is 500,000, don't write 100,000 in there, because if they counter at 510,000, they're no longer at 20%, they're more like at 18%, and they might have to pay mortgage insurance. So the rule is that if you change your down payment amount, believe it or not, up or down, after the first 5 days, you have to get the seller's permission. So we don't want to be in that trick box, so always fill in a percentage of the purchase price. Buyers shall make application to pay the balance of the purchase price and pay. Here's what application means. They're going to pay the application fee, and they are going to provide, it's down here, their name, their income, social security number, property address, purchase price, and loan amount. So one critical thing on here is property address. Buyers cannot do a full application for a loan of any kind until they have a property address identified. So they can go get pre-qualified. That's why we call it pre-qualification. They give them all their credit information. They give them their checking information, their job information. They pull their credit score. They get all that all ready to go. But the other half of the equation on financing that the lender is going to look at is the property itself. So you have to have a property identified. Okay. So as soon as you get what we call under contract or an accepted contract, you want to make sure you get that information over to the loan officer who has done the underwriting. Is it possible for somebody to be an extremely strong borrower, lots of money in the bank, great job, lots of money down payment, 800 credit score, and still get turned down for a loan? Yeah, it is. Why would that be? Because the property doesn't qualify. So the underwriter, who's the person who makes the final lending decision for the bank, not only looks at the borrower, but they also look at the property. And so they want to make sure if they're making a 30-year loan on a piece of property, that there's 30 years left in the house, right? So if it's a tear down, roof is sagging, foundation is failing, septic is gone, you know, they're going to look at all of these things when they send the appraiser out. So the house has to qualify as well. So if you have a fixer, it's always a good idea to talk to your favorite lender and find out if there's alternative lending solutions out there, or maybe it's just going to have to be an all cash deal. If the house is really, really bad and a lender won't finance it, it's probably going to have to be all cash, or they're going to have to pull out money from a home equity line from another piece of property. That's common in investor scenarios, buying for investment property. Here's something, I'm going to back up a little bit, that I really want to make sure that you cover with your buyers, because this is one of those deadlines that they can't miss. This number, remember we've talked about this number can be shortened. So what it basically says is buyers shall make application for the loan and pay the application fee for the subject property within 5 days after mutual acceptance. So you get mutual acceptance on a Monday. When would they have to make application by? I told you I was going to pound this in your head. Hold your space bar down. Tell me what?
5 days.
Friday,
Monday. Monday if it's not a holiday. At what time?
9 p.m.
9 p.m. Yeah. Okay. So if you're the seller and you had 10 offers on a piece of property and nobody changes this time frame, basically that buyer has almost a week to get into the bank and make formal application. And you have to remember that this financing is a contingency, that if the buyer or the property fails to qualify, the buyer gets their earnest money back and the seller is back to square one. They have to start all over again. So if you're a listing broker, how excited are you going to be if that buyer has an entire week to dink around and get out there and make application? Not very excited. Okay. So one of the strategic ways that you can make your offer more competitive is to shorten up that application time frame. If they've already been in and they've already made their application, I would shorten it up to 1 day. Why not? And in this competitive market, if you have somebody in your car driving them around or they're following you around and they haven't been to a lender and been pre-qualified, they're probably not going to have a snowball's chance, even if they find a house they love and want to make an offer on it, because the seller wants to know that they have their financial ducks in a row. So it's super important that you have that conversation. And then this is the first thing you're going to be talking to your buyer about. How many days is it going to take you to make your application? They don't need to meet with a lender. They can do it all. Excuse me, they can do it all online. So there's really no reason to take the full 5 days. If you do modify that, let's say down to 1 day, and I'm going to back up here a little bit and look at you. So best practice, when you submit an offer on a property to another agent, is to do an email that hits on the highlights of the offer that you're sending over. We are offering X. We have an escalation addendum that takes us to Y, and it's in increments of $5,000. The borrowers have been pre-approved. I've attached a letter from their lender. We've shortened up the inspection to 2 days. We already have an appointment with the inspector. We're ready to go. All of these things, because you have to remember, if this listing broker has 10 offers on a property and each contract averages 20 pages or 25 pages, that's a lot of paperwork for that person to go through. So why not make their job easier? It was like Blake did that video on the roundtable with Jared James. I think it was last week. Why not make their job easier? Why not go ahead and be professional and give them the bullet points, the talking points of the offer? The other thing is, don't just email over an offer out of the blue. It's listing brokers, they hate that. Number one, it can get caught up in their spam filter and they never ever see it. But number two, at least have the courtesy to say, hey, Kelly, I just wrote an offer on your property out on 1234 B Street. And I've got a really great offer for you. And I just emailed it to you. If you don't receive it, would you please let me know? Or you can shoot her a text message. And just give them a heads up. We just had that happen the other day, and an agent came stomping in my office and they're like, oh my God, I just got 2 offers out of the blue. No call from the listing broker, no idea they were even coming. I have no idea who these people are. And so you're already at a disadvantage if you're that unprofessional right out of the chute. So be professional.
I agree, Lori. I've seen it way too many times. It is absolutely embarrassing that those brokers are not trained properly. At least a text, if not a call. And in this market, you should be asking what the seller wants, period. End of story. Do they want a rent back? Do they want a closing that's 45 days out, 30 days out? What's most attractive to the seller? You're not doing your job as a buyer's agent if you aren't asking those questions in today's market.
100%. And then I get asked, are there any questions? Well, I didn't think I could ask them that. Hey, you know what? There's really nothing you can't ask. As a listing broker, you may not answer them. Like, what's the highest offer you've got? Or how high do you think it's going to go? Or what are the sellers hoping to get for price? There's nothing that says you can't ask that. The listing broker may not tell you, but then again, they might. Remember who you're working for. In most cases, you're working for your buyer. And your buyer is expecting you to go in and gather up all this information before the offer gets written so that you can advise them when the offer is being written and structured to give them the best position to get their offer accepted. So conversation with the listing broker in advance, if you can, ask a lot of questions, have them, I always say this, have the questions written down in advance. If you've got a half a dozen questions, just jot them down before you make the call so you don't get off the call and go, oh, damn, I forgot to ask him, da-da-da, because you can become a pest. You don't want to be a pest. But the other thing you might want to ask, if they say that they're reviewing offers on Friday and it's Tuesday, I would say, have you received any other offers? Are they really going to wait until Friday? Sometimes sellers say, absolutely, positively, I will not look at offers until Friday. And other times they say, well, I don't know. If a super good offer comes in on Wednesday, we're going to take a hard look at it. And you don't want to be sitting around waiting to submit your offer on Friday and find out it went under contract 2 days before that. That is not a good call to give your buyers. So Kelly, I'm going to pull you in again. So you have something with an extended offer review date. You're representing a buyer. And the buyer says, well, do we wait till the last minute so we don't show our hand, or do we submit early, or what's your best strategy? What do you like?
I always recommend to submit. I think it's not good practice to wait to the end. I have one right now going. So 2 offers are in hand. The seller doesn't want to review until next Tuesday. But you know what I've seen, and I saw it this last weekend, is my clients, the seller was antsy as hell. They wanted to take one of those offers, even though we had one of those review dates. You will miss the opportunity if you don't get your offer in, because here's what happens. Any good listing agent, once your offer's in, they should come back at you and say, highest and best, or hey, can you tweak this in the offer? Can you change this? And sometimes you can go back to your buyer and they will, and they won. So otherwise you would have lost the opportunity. Like I had another one text me yesterday on another property. He sends me a text. He goes, here's our offer, Kelly, in text. We've written on 5 properties and we lost. And I said, I cannot believe you're not sending this to me over in writing. I said, you need to write it up and send it to me. I said, because you may win. And so by just sending me a text of your actual offer doesn't show me that you got skin in the game without presenting that offer, in writing in a purchase and sale agreement. They're looking for insight, which is great, and they're communicating, which is great, but I want to see it in writing. So that way, if my client does say and call me like, hey, Kelly, I just want to take this one. I'm sick of the showings. I'm sick of the open houses. I want to be done. You would have done your buyer a huge disservice by not putting that offer in writing as soon as possible.
100%. That's what I call, it's an old fashioned term, but it's a would you take. And it's basically saying, hey, would your sellers take this, or would your sellers take that? Well, I have no idea. Put the damn thing in writing, submit it to me, show me their intent, give me a good earnest money, give me a great offer. And I'm going to talk to them about it. And like Kelly says, they may be willing to do it. Here's another mistake I see a lot of people make. Oh, I'm not worried about it because I told the listing broker, I told Linda that if they were getting ready to take another offer, just give me a call and we'll write something up. Yeah. Mariah's like, yeah, no, that doesn't happen that way. Sometimes it does, but most times it doesn't. And then again, you got to go back to your buyer and go, oops, sorry. I know I said it was best practice to wait to the end, but yeah, they just accepted something else. And can you believe it? They didn't even call me. Well, you know what? We got 1,000+ people out in this neck of the woods, Whatcom, Skagit Island, probably 1,500 people. Not all of them are on boot camp calls for contracts like this. They don't know best practice if it bit them in the butt. They don't. And some of them are going to call and some of them aren't. Some of them are going to play dirty pool. They're going to have their own buyer. They're not going to want to call because they want to get their offer accepted. Welcome to the real world of real estate. So you need to have your strategy straight in your brain so that you can explain it to your buyer and come up with a plan, a best practice of how this is going to go. So I just went way off track on that one. But I think that is the strategies of offer presentations are critical in this one.
Collaboration with the other agent is also critical, you guys. So if you can send a bomb video or a little video, if you don't know that other agent on the other side, reassuring them you have a solid lender, having the lender reach out to them, say, hey, I'm gonna have the lender just leave a voicemail on your introducing themselves saying this buyer is rock solid. And then also saying, hey, I just want you to know we get deals done. I'm here to be collaborative with you. And I want to make this as easy as possible on your seller. So I just want you to know I'm going to be pushing forward to get this thing closed. Introducing yourself, putting a name with a face, especially if you're new to the market and people don't know who you are as an agent. I think that would be a really good practice to send a little intro video to the other agent saying you're going to do everything possible to get this deal closed. And work collaboratively with them.
Absolutely. And that you're going to do your job. Now, what does that mean? So many times listing brokers end up carrying both sides, or the buyer broker might end up carrying both sides because the listing broker doesn't do their job. You need to reassure that other broker that you're a professional and you are going to do your job. You are going to meet deadlines. You are going to stay on top of the file. You're going to give them updates. those are just, I mean, they seem like, I can't even believe I'm having to say that, but that is, believe it or not, almost a unique selling proposition in this market because not everybody does it. So be the professional. Like Kelly says, shoot yourself a bomb video, shoot yourself something on an iPhone, send it over, introduce yourself. There's a lot of lenders out there that frankly are doing the same thing. There's like Dylan over at Umpqua, I know, always sends a video over to the listing broker on behalf of his buying client, introducing himself and talking about that buyer and how pre-qualified they are. So these are the little unique things that are going to set you apart from the competition. And I can't stress it enough. You need every single leg up that you can possibly get in this environment.
Lori,
So-
I'm curious, how many people are presenting in person in Whatcom anymore? Is
Nobody.
anybody? Nobody. Just curious.
Not really. I can't remember though. Well, they're not presenting in person. What they're doing is like if it's their listing, a lot of times the sellers will come into the office and meet with the listing broker and get the offers presented in person. So if that's what you mean, but as far as buyer brokers presenting directly to the seller, I haven't seen it in a really long time. Are you seeing it down in Anacortes?
No, I don't see it, but it is a strategy, especially if you're writing on a luxury property and you feel like your offer isn't going to be presented in the best light. You actually can request to meet with the seller and the listing broker to present in person. Especially when you've got little details in there, like, weird things about commission, weird things about paying the seller's closing costs, things that you think that the other agent doesn't understand and you've tried to explain it to them. Those are good opportunities to present in person.
Absolutely. I got a couple hands up. Julie, go.
Oh, hi. Hey,
Hi.
I wanted to say that in the last couple of years, when it's an older seller, I have had a little light bulb go off and say, hey, would you like to present this? I'd be happy to come to their home or wherever, safe distance, COVID, blah, 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 and present the offer in person. And in the old days, like before 2 years ago, and before 5 years ago, before somewhere in the back 10 years, that's what was standard. And I have had a couple of younger agents go like double take, like, what? Present an offer in person? And just so you know, if you have an older client, they might expect and prefer that level of service. And it is a level of service.
Absolutely. And it
We
gives
used
you
to
an
make up
opportunity. If they like you,
Mhm.
then there's a good opportunity that they're going to like your offer. That's when you have the opportunity to interject. If you can't get face to face, nothing wrong with a video. Nothing wrong with the video, you guys. So
And just remember, we do have our conference rooms and receptionists set up to provide that safe sanitary environment of a professional building where you can line them up to come in if
Yep.
needed.
Tessa Jarvis.
Oh, I was just going to touch on the video too, what Kelly was saying. So I send a video with all my buyers' offers and I just introduce myself really quick, but I present the offer in that video. And when I do it, I'm speaking to the listing agent. But what happens is the listing agent will often show that to the seller. And so that's a way to present in person in our virtual world. And then include a resume. So I always put my resume, it's the one that I send to my buyers to show, hey, if you decide to hire me, here's all the things that I will do for you. I just include that over to the listing agent and I say, hey, just a quick glance, here's everything I do for my clients. None of that is going to fall on your plate. I'm going to be working really hard to get this deal closed, and you can see all of the touch points that I will do throughout the transaction. And so that just gets attached in with the offer.
That is gold.
That's
Did everybody
awesome.
pick up on that? That is absolutely gold. The resume, thank you for that. I forgot about that, especially when you're dealing with a broker that you've never done a deal with. You might know who they are, but you've never done a deal with them. Even if you have, I think it's just a good professional matter of course to send your resume and like Tessa said, the list of things that you're going to do on behalf of your client. Anything you can do to make that listing broker's job easier and convince the seller that your buyer is actually going to perform and close on the contract. Because trust me, these sellers, once they make a decision, they don't want to back up and start over again. Listing a house for sale is not fun. They don't like it. It's like going to the dentist. You got to keep the dishes out of the sink and the beds made, and you got to leave when there's open houses or showings. It's a pain in the butt. They do not want to start over. So they're looking for the offer that has the highest likelihood of actually getting across the finish line and closing. That's what you are selling. All right. Good conversation. All right, here we go. I'm going back to my financing addendum. And here we go. So they got 5 days to make the application. You're going to put in the percentage of how much they're going to put down. And then it says, if not waived, the financing contingency shall survive the closing date. So what does that mean? We get up to the closing date, the financing is not done. A couple of things you need to know about this. If your bank is unable to perform by the closing date and the contract expires, the seller is under no obligation to extend. Hear me on that. So if there's another offer or the seller changes their mind and decides not to sell and you're supposed to close on February 1st and you're 1 day away from getting those loan docs and you can make your closing by February 2nd, guess what? You put an extension in front of that seller to February 2nd and they are under no obligation at all to give you even a 1 day extension. And that's a shock to a lot of people. And they're like, but it's not my fault, but the lender, the appraiser was late. It doesn't matter. That seller is under no obligation to extend. Do not miss a closing date or have a conversation early on with the listing broker if you know you're going to need an extension. That's why it's critical that you communicate on a consistent basis with your lender. So if you're going to have your lenders in your lender pool, you've got 1, 2, 3 of them that you love to do business with, and you sit down and you lay out your expectations. If you want to work with me, here's one of the things I expect. If we're not going to make the closing date, I want to know early. I want to know as soon as you get a glimmer that we're going to have a hiccup and we might need a couple extra days. I don't want to be scrambling on the morning of closing to run around and try and get an extension signed. Because again, the seller's under no obligation to sign it. So if the buyer misses the deadline, that 5 days, if they fail to make application for financing within the agreed time, 1 day, 5 day, whatever it is, or these are ors, changes the type of loan at any time without the seller's prior written consent, they go from a conventional to an FHA, or they go from an FHA to a VA, or whatever, they change a loan type, or they changed lenders. Oh, I was with ABC, but then I saw an ad from XYZ and they got a better interest rate and lower points and blah, 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 blah. So I just went ahead and moved over there, moved my whole loan package. It's after the agreed upon time to apply for financing expires, then the financing contingency, you need to cover this with your buyer, is waived. We just took away that safety net of if you or the house can't qualify for the loan, and you didn't make it on time, or you change loan types, or you change lenders and you don't get prior permission. And this is after the time frame for application. So it defaults to 5 days. So on day 6, if they change lenders, if we leave it at 5 days, if we put it to 1 on day 2, if they change lenders, if they change loan types, or if they haven't made their application, they basically waive. The contract still goes on. It's not a, oh, well, never mind, I'll just walk away and start over again. No, the contract survives that, but the safety net of the financing is now gone. So this is obviously a critical conversation that you want to have with your buyer. So buyer's waiver of the financing contingency under this also constitutes waiver of paragraph 5, appraisal less than sales price. And I'll get to that in a minute. So, and then they spell out a lender and who a lender is, the person that makes money, that loans the money. And then it says, this is nice, but it's not always effective. Buyer authorizes listing broker and seller to inquire about the status of the buyer's loan approval with lender at any time prior to closing. Well, you can ask, and some lenders will actually give you an update, and other lenders will tell you to go pound sand. It's none of your business. You're not my client. The buyer's my client. I'm not going to tell you a thing. Tessa, I'm laughing about this because you and I definitely went through this with, was it Navy Woodby? The person doing the loan file went on vacation for 2 weeks during the closing date, and crickets. Anyway, deal closed, but it was a long one. Financing contingency. So there is seller's notice to perform. So this gets confusing. Stay with me. So it has a default up here. It says select A or B, and it defaults to A if not selected. Some people make the mistake of, well, you don't know the difference between these two. If you don't check either box, the box is over here, one of these, it's going to default to this one right here. So basically, the buyer has 21 days after mutual acceptance. So again, get your calendar out, count out your 21 days, and this one cannot, remember, can't end on a weekend or holiday. Seller can give what's called a notice to perform, requesting the buyer waive the financing contingency, and the seller may give notice to terminate 3 days after that notice if the buyer doesn't waive. What does all that mean? That basically means the seller's given the buyer 3 weeks. That is the default. You might want to shorten it up, but the seller's giving the buyer 3 weeks to not only get their loan approved, get their appraisal done, get their inspection done, and be prepared to waive. Another conversation to have with your buyer. So if you get a notice to perform on day 22, your buyer shouldn't be surprised, because hopefully you've had this conversation with them. And most listing brokers, a lot of them are giving that notice to perform, not because they don't believe the buyer has the financial wherewithal. It's just a matter of good practice. And that comes from Annie Fitzsimmons, our hotline attorney. So there is a form for that. So seller gives a notice on day 22. We'll stick with the defaults. The buyer has 3 days. So they have 3 more days. So day 22, 23, 24, 25, you got until 9 p.m. 25 days into a contract. I would sure hope that your buyer has been through underwriting and there's been an appraisal been done, unless you've run into glitches. This is another reason why you do not wait to order the appraisal. Period. Do not wait. Do not wait. Do not wait. The buyer has to be vested in the property. They have to be prepared to put up the money. So one or two things happens. The buyer either comes back and waives the financing contingency, although they can waive the financing, but not the appraisal if the appraisal isn't done. And that's down here, appraisal less than sales price. So buyer's waiver of financing will or will not constitute waiver of the financing itself, and it defaults to will not. What does that mean? If you leave all the defaults in here and on day 22, the buyer waives the financing, the appraisal is protected in there. So in other words, if the appraisal is done on day 26 and it comes in low, the buyer still retains the right to go back and try and negotiate with the seller to either lower it or walk away from the contract, frankly. So how attractive do you think that's going to be to a listing broker? And again, I'm not going to give you answers on this. I'm just giving you kind of ideas for strategy that you need to be aware these things are in here. So what happens if on day 22, the seller gives the notice and 3 days later, the buyer does nothing? They don't waive, because that's one of the options. If they do nothing, then if the buyer has not, here it is, notice of termination. If the buyer has not previously waived on day 22 through 25, seller may give notice of termination at any time 3 days after the delivery of the notice to perform. Doesn't have to be on day 22. It can be given on day 25. It can be given on day 28. It cannot be given before day 21 unless you have shortened this up. If the seller gives the notification before the buyer has waived, the agreement's terminated. So if your buyer dinks around for those 3 days and then says, oh God, I'm not really comfortable, it hasn't been through underwriting, they're really slow, I didn't get them all the paperwork. And on day 27, the seller gets a better offer or changes their mind about selling, I call it having an axe over your head. That seller can drop that axe and terminate the contract, and your buyer can do absolutely nothing about it, neither can you. So if you get a notice to perform, you need to have a serious discussion with your buyer, highly encourage them to go through the waiver. If you've got the appraisal less than sales price, defaulted to the appraisal isn't waived. So what happens if the buyer is not all the way through underwriting and they're kind of iffy and you're not really sure if they're going to be able to get the loan or not? You better have a serious conversation. The only way, so what is at risk at this point? What is at risk is their earnest money. That's the worst case scenario because you've checked the box on the first page. So if they're not willing to risk their earnest money and they cannot get their financing ducks in a row so that they're comfortable moving forward, you may have no choice but to terminate the contract. So actually, back up. The buyer does not have the choice of terminating the contract. Scratch that. The seller has the choice of terminating the contract at that particular point. So buyer does nothing. It can go all the way to closing, and the seller can never give that notice to terminate, but the buyer cannot walk away. Sorry, that's one that I've always had stuck in my head backwards. Option B is the automatic waiver, which basically says at the end of 21 days at 9 p.m. on day 21, unless that number is changed, the financing automatically is waived. It automatically goes away. Seller doesn't have to give the notice. Buyer doesn't have 3 days. It's just on day 22, according to this default at 9 p.m., financing is waived. But you will notice down here, it also has the same little appraisal less than sales price with the default of will not right here. So by waiving the financing on day 22, nothing even has to happen. It just automatically gets waived. But you do have the appraisal protection unless you have checked the box will. So what it says, buyer's waiver of the financing under this paragraph will constitute waiver of the appraisal less than sales price. And I'll get to that in just a second. So that safeguard about the appraisal is defaulted and built into both. That's a little bit of a buyer protection. Again, you would want to have the conversation. If you've started your appraisal, you know you're ready to go. Your buyers are totally pre-approved. The property's in town. You know you can get an appraiser out there. Want to make your offer stronger? Check will not. That's going to be attractive to a listing broker. I don't see it a lot. The common course is to check will. I'm going to skip down. I'll come back to that other part, but I'm going to cover appraisal less than sales price.
Lori, can I ask for clarification, please?
Sure.
Lori Kester here.
Hi, Laura.
Back on 2B2, I'm sorry, on B, automatic waiver of financing contingency. So if we checked appraisal less than sale price, if we check will not, let's say for some reason the 21 days is up and and on day 22 or day 23, we then receive the appraisal back. Let's say we hadn't had it earlier. You're saying that appraisal still protects that?
If you have not checked, if you haven't checked a box because it defaults to will not, let me read the whole thing again and it might make more sense. So buyer's waiver of the financing contingency under this paragraph, it defaults to will not. So I'll just read the whole thing. Will not constitute waiver of the paragraph 5, appraisal less than sales price, which throws you into the back and forth of a low appraisal, taking into consideration the 22 AD.
Okay, so that low appraisal protects the automatic waiver of financing.
Correct. It's
okay.
It's
great. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's baked in here. So it would be strong to tell that listing broker, look, we're going to go in. You don't even have to serve us notice on day 22. Boom, we're going to waive it because we're that sure we're going to get our financing in order. But remember what I said back in the beginning, it's not just the borrower, it's also the house. So the appraisal part is the house part. So the buyer is going to waive their financing, but they're not waiving the house part. They're not waiving the appraisal part. They want to make sure the value is there. And oh, by the way, the appraiser can also call out things like, I don't think that roof is in really good shape and I don't think it's got 6 months left, right? If it's a government one, it's not unusual for an appraiser to call out things like what they call earth to wood contact. There's a bunch of dirt pushed up against the foundation, sagging gutters, no handrails on the front porch. These are things that an inspector may call out and the buyer says, oh, hell, I don't even care. I'm going to take it anyway. But if the appraiser comes back and calls them out, they have to be fixed. Okay. Notice the low appraisal. So if the lender's appraisal of the property is less than the purchase price, then the buyer may, after they get that, within 3 days, give a notice of low appraisal, which shall include a copy of the lender's appraisal. I will share something with you. Neither Blake or I are a fan of this form. And the reason we're not a fan of this form is because, let me get to it here. It basically, in this notice of low appraisal, it only has one path you can go down. You give a notice of low appraisal. If the seller doesn't agree, the deal dies. And that's usually not the intent of the parties. So what's a better practice? A better practice is to pick up the phone and say, hey, Kelly, bad news. I just got the appraisal in on D Street and it came in $25,000 low. Now, my buyers have already agreed that they're going to pay up to $15,000 for a low appraisal on what's called a 22 AD. We'll cover that in a minute, but we're still short the money. Do you think there's any wiggle room in there? So if I send over a request that the seller maybe lower the price $5,000, if the buyer sends over a request to lower the price $5,000, that is what we call a unilateral request. It's a one person asking another person, or one party asking another party to please lower the price. If the other party doesn't agree to lower the price, then the buyer can say, okay, never mind, I tried, I've got the 5,000, I'm going to pay it anyway. Right? In the notice of low appraisal, when they go back and forth, if the seller refuses to lower the price, the deal dies. You need to understand the forms and when to use them. And this is one particular case. We do not recommend using the notice of low appraisal for simply that reason. You don't want to kill the deal. You just want to negotiate a price if you possibly can. But you still want to give the buyer the option of buying it anyway or coming up with the additional funds. Tessa, I see you reading.
The deal dies. I thought the buyer just waived their financing contingency.
Notice of low appraisal. Oh, wait a minute. I got to stop my share and start it again because I'm sure that didn't work.
Well, that was, your screen was shared.
There we go.
Like
Buyer's
if the seller
notice.
says pound sand,
So notice of rejection. So buyer gives notice that seller rejects. Buyer's notice of low appraisal will not get a reappraisal, not get a reconsideration, does not consent to a reduction in the purchase price. So no, I'm not coming down $5,000. Doesn't propose a new purchase price. And oh, you're right. They did change that. You're right. So the buyer can terminate at that point. The buyer
if
can,
they don't have the money, they can say, okay, fine, I terminate, right? I don't have any
Yep.
other choice.
I don't have any other choice. They can accept if the seller reduces the purchase price. But wait a minute. Where is the option? Because this form is always confusing. Where is the option that the buyer says, never mind, I'll go forward and do it anyway?
They have to waive. That's the tough part. And that's what I tell my buyers. The risk you're taking is that you have to waive your financing contingency. So if you are rock solid, because I've had clients that are, yep, deliver the notice. And I'm like, okay. And they're like, if the seller says no, we'll move forward anyways. I said, okay, but I just want you to know the risk you're going to take is that in order to continue to move forward, you have to waive your financing contingency.
There you go.
And so some of them are like, okay.
Which is right here.
So they waive and then they can move forward.
Right.
But and at that point, I mean, most likely nothing's going to happen. But I just always tell them, I like you to have the safety net as long as you can. But if you're willing to let that go, then we deliver the notice. And worst case scenario, you make up the difference and your financing contingency is waived and we move forward and close.
Right. So if the seller proposes to reduce the purchase price and they meet somewhere in the middle, this one, acceptance of reduced purchase price, you're right. Actually, I think you and Summer were responsible for getting this form updated because it used to be the seller had no choice but to terminate, and that wasn't the intent. So when you have a government loan, FHA, VA, USDA, seller consented to reduce the purchase price to not more than the appraised value. So I'm not going to get in the weeds on this one, but just know that with a government loan, you have a whole different set of rules for buyer protection of low appraisals. The buyer always has the option of paying more, but they're under no legal obligation to do so. They always have the out of the contract. So if an FHA loan comes in low, the buyer always has the option of walking away. And the argument with the 22 AD, which is that, okay, we're going to make this offer, but if the appraisal comes in low, we're willing to pay $5,000 over the low appraisal. There isn't clarity on that yet, whether that is a valid addendum with a government loan, because there's so many baked in protections for veteran buyers and FHA buyers that the question becomes, does the federal trump the local? It can show intent. I haven't had that problem before, but just know if you're dealing with a government loan, there is something in here that protects the buyer again. So thank you for that. See, even the instructor gets a little rusty on this good stuff. Okay, are you guys back with the financing or do I need to switch screens again? You're back, okay. So here we go. So notice the low appraisal. So, and again, we're dragging this thing out. If you've gone 21 days and the appraisal comes in on day 24, and then it takes a couple, well, the appraisal comes in on day 24, then the seller has 10 days after the buyers have notice of low appraisal to give notice that they're going to try and go out and get a reappraisal or reconsideration of value. Sometimes that works. That's working with the lender. Seller's consent to reduce the purchase price to come all the way down to the appraised value or down a portion of that gap. Or seller's proposal to reduce the purchase price and for the buyer to pay the additional funds. So the seller's going to come down a little and the buyer's going to come up, and they're going to meet somewhere in the middle. Or the seller has the opportunity to reject the buyer's notice of low appraisal. And if they reject, then we're back to what Tessa just pointed out. The buyer really, if they want to stay in contract, is going to have to waive their financing. So that can be really scary for buyers. And I don't just mean first time ones. I mean, they're buying $1 million property. These are setting expectations. Remember, I said motivation and setting expectations. Setting expectations. People do not like surprises. You need to know this form well enough, and as confusing as it is, you need to know it well enough that you can explain it to a buyer in layman's terms and say, you know, I'm going to remind you of the deadlines, but I don't want to have this conversation when we get a low appraisal. I actually want to have you understanding what happens if we do in advance. So you're not freaking out over a low appraisal. And then I'm also trying to explain to you what your options are. Hopefully you've already explained them. You're going to review them again, but they're looking to you for the knowledge. And even though you may have only been in business a very, very short time, that's why I say it's critical you know these forms so that you can allay those buyers' fears. Make them feel like they're dealing with a competent professional who knows what they're doing and understands the forms and will help them avoid the pitfalls of the contract. That's our jobs. So here's our choices. Buyer shall have 3 days. So we've gone 10 days and then we've gone 3 days. Remember the part that said financing survives closing? So if nobody gets an extension, but both parties agree to go forward, this financing survives. So let's say you get no extension signed, but everybody's still working forward. And a week after closing, the scheduled closing date, a week later, the loan gets rejected for whatever reason. Couldn't come to terms on the appraisal, underwriter, the buyer lost their job. They went out and bought a new car and their credit score went to crap. A lot of things can happen. Because that financing survived closing, if the buyer was unable to get financing under the terms and conditions that they specified, the buyer is still protected and will be entitled to get their earnest money back. Because financing survived closing. So, supposed to close on March 1st, and on March 5th, we're all still scrambling. We're trying to get the docs out, and all of a sudden, boom, buyer calls you up and says, hey, Julie, I got really bad news. I just lost my job. And you don't have an extension in place. Financing survives closing, which means that buyer is still protected and is entitled to get their earnest money back. Julie.
Hey, could you talk about the requirements of the lender letter that we're going to want to get on behalf of those buyer clients that says buyers did make a good faith effort, blah, blah, blah. And there's a couple of key specific points that have to be covered by a lender letter that we're going to want to deliver on their behalf.
And I gotta find it. I think it's back.
And what's your opinion on sending them to a second lender and getting a second letter? One letter will do. I'm remembering something from the past about making a good faith effort with more than one lender.
No, you would just get it from the lender that you made the application with. Now, if some people get cute and they leave their application open with lender A and then they go over to lender B and start a simultaneous application, and they don't tell either lender that they've got both of these in play. As long as the first lender has not closed the file, they can get a termination letter from that first lender and it would be considered valid. in order for them to get their earnest money back. I don't want to get that deep into this because this is kind of boot camp 101. But it says, here's what Julie's talking about, and it's paragraph 4 on page 2. And these are the steps the buyer needs to go to get their earnest money back in the event they're unable to procure their financing. And this is very, very, very specific, and a lot of lenders don't know about this, or they just kind of blow it off and ignore it. So if the buyer hasn't waived the financing and they're unable to obtain financing by closing after a good faith effort, that's a whole nother conversation. They can't just go silent on the lender and refuse to provide the things that the lender is asking for. Part of a contract term, and this is contract law, is a good faith covenant. That means that both parties agree to perform under what they've agreed to do. So the buyer needs to get in the bank statements, and they need to get in the check stubs and the things that the lender, they're going to tear their hair out because they're going to like, God, they want my firstborn. I can't believe I need to provide all this, but they have to cooperate with the lender. That's good faith. So if after all that goes on and the buyer is unable to obtain financing, the agreement shall terminate. However, the earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer after, this is important, the lender confirms in writing, i.e. the lender sends a letter that contains the date the buyer's loan application was made, including a copy of the loan estimate that was provided to the buyer. There's something that has to go out within 3 days. It's a federal requirement of the buyer making application. So that's number one. Got to have in the letter the date. You got to have a copy of the loan estimate. They have to state that the buyer possessed sufficient funds to close. That would be, in this case, the down payment amount. If they go out and buy a new car and blow through all their down payment, and that's the reason that they can't close because they don't have sufficient funds to close, they don't have a legal excuse to cancel the contract. They're going to be out their earnest money. So that's an important conversation to have with your buyers. My joking way of putting it so that they really understand. I just helped my sister buy a house. I love her to pieces, but she likes to spend money. I said, okay, from now until closing, here's the new rule. You are not allowed to go out and spend more than $100 without my permission. That kind of rang true. I've seen people go out and buy new cars. There was a furniture sale out at Samuel's. I just went and bought a whole living room set for my entire new house because they had a special with zero financing. They spent the money. It's amazing what people spend money on. So you have to talk to them about that. But if they didn't do that and they've still got the money for the down payment, they've got sufficient funds, and they spell out the reasons the buyer was unable to obtain financing. They lost their job. They were unable to qualify. The appraisal was low. If the seller terminates the agreement, the earnest money shall be refunded without need for a confirmation. What does that mean? That means that technically escrow is supposed to return their earnest money without a seller's signature on a release form. I will tell you, in real life, that will not happen. In real life, the escrow, Chicago, Whatcom Land Title, whoever it is, they are not going to turn loose of that money without both signatures agreeing that the money needs to be turned loose and refunded to the buyer. That's reality. So that's what Julie's talking about. So if you have a buyer that doesn't qualify, is unable to go through with a loan, I want you to pull out this agreement, and it's great if you would do a screenshot and send it to the lender just as a reminder. These are the things I need in order to get the buyer's earnest money back. Okay, with me? Did I answer your question, Julie?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
You're welcome. Backing up here, loan cost provisions. So this is where the buyer is asking the seller to pay some money to help them with their down payment, to help them with their closing costs. Not so common anymore, but if you have a buyer, and let's say they both got super good jobs, they're both in tech, or they're both doctors, or they're both whatever, they just got out of college fairly recently, and they just don't have a lot of money in the bank, right? Then we may have to ask the seller for a little contribution to help us get the loan. How is that normally covered? Usually the seller says, sure, I'm happy to give you an extra $5,000 if you raise the sales price $5,000 to help offset that. Then you get into appraisals, then you get into a bunch of other things, but you definitely can do it. There's nothing to prohibit it at all. So that just kind of balances the playing field for the seller. And it does happen. You can have a gold-plated borrower with an 800 credit score who has $2,000 in the bank. So you can ask for the seller to contribute, and that money can be applied to, and here it's all spelled out. Prepaids, these all have to do with the loan. Prepaids, loan discount, loan fee, interest rate buy down, financing, and then closing and other costs allowed by the lender. So that means it can also go towards prepaid insurance. It can go towards prorated taxes. It can go through anything that's on that closing statement to help the buyer offset the cost of getting into a house. Now, what happens if you ask for and I've seen this happen, $10,000 buyer or seller concession to help the buyer get into the house, and the seller agrees, and the property appraises, and so now the buyer has 10 grand to use towards whatever they want to use on the closing statement. But they forget, the selling broker, forgets to talk to the lender about the fact that that money is in there. And the lender says, hey, well, Amina, great news. We only needed to use $7,000 of that. I have actually had buying brokers, selling brokers come back and say, great, then just have the seller cut us a check for the balance. It doesn't work that way. You use it or you lose it. So if you get a $10,000 concession from the seller and you don't spend it, it goes back to the seller. So it's up to you to inform that lender, and you would think that would be a no-brainer because the lender's got a copy of this contract, but trust me, it happens. If you get a seller concession, you need to talk to that lender and make sure they use every last nickel. There's other things they can spend it on, prorated taxes, interest rate buy downs, prepaids, that if they don't spend it, it goes away. That would be a rookie mistake, and I've seen it happen. There was somebody from another company that starts with a K that basically left $8,000 on the closing table for their buyer because they missed that. And they honestly said, we'll just have the seller cut us a check for $8,000. Nope. And it was the day of closing. How do you think that conversation with his buyer went? Probably not well. Okay, so we've been through the inspection. Go back and finish reading it. Here's where it talks about the inspection. This is the appraiser, by the way. Seller shall permit inspections required by lender. So the appraiser is the one that's going to call those out. And it's kind of like a 35, included but not limited to structural, pest, heating, plumbing, roof, electrical, septic, well. But seller is not obligated to pay for the inspections unless otherwise agreed. So the seller has to allow them. So the appraiser calls out the roof. And the seller can't prohibit having a roofer out there, but the seller is under no obligation to pay for a new roof because of this. So you're back to the negotiating table. So remember what I've said. You negotiate the price when you go in and the terms of the contract. You're going to negotiate probably on the inspection. You're going to negotiate on maybe a low appraisal. And then you might have to negotiate some inspections and repairs on the appraisal as well. There's a lot of negotiations that goes on in a contract, and it's certainly not over when you get mutual. Remind your clients that. USVA or FHA, VA, USDA appraisal certificate. So they call their appraisal something a little bit different. And this is where it is covered with the various government entities. Buyer still has to pay for the appraisal, and they can still give notice of low appraisal. But the difference is, at least with FHA, there are a limited amount of appraisers that are approved to do FHA appraisals. There's a very limited number that are approved to do VA appraisals. These are specialized appraisers that are sent out to the property. And one thing you need to know, if an FHA appraisal is done on a property, so seller has agreed to an FHA financing, you get an FHA appraiser out there, and the appraisal comes in $15,000 low. And the buyer says, oh gosh, I don't have 15 grand, and the seller won't come down. If the transaction is failing, one thing you need to know, and this might help save the deal, is FHA appraisals run with the property. What does that mean? Your buyer walks away, the appraisal was done last week, property goes back on the market, seller agrees to another FHA financed contract. That FHA appraisal that was done for your buyer runs with the property for 6 months. So the seller is stuck with an FHA appraisal for 6 months. Does anybody know about VA and how long and if they run with the property? I think they do.
I do.
Amelia, thank you.
So VA is a lot of what I did in Virginia. And the VA actually stays with the veteran.
Oh, okay.
So it runs with the buyer.
So what about the appraisal though? Because they're no longer buying the house. Does the appraisal run with the property?
Nope, it stays with the veteran. So if they
Okay.
end up circling back to that property at a later date, it would still stay with them.
Thank you. That's good to know. So FHA runs with the property, VA runs with the veteran. Little tidbits. And again, you hopefully have a lender to rely on. If you're doing government loans, you need to be working with a lender that knows government loans. You need to have a general working knowledge of it, but you're going to rely on the professional to take care of that. Thank you. VA mandatory clause, and here's some more verbiage. If they're obtaining VA financing, that's required to be put in there by the federal government. They cannot end up forfeiting their earnest money for a low appraisal, and they're under no obligation to complete no matter what it says. And the extension of closing for this was put in probably 10 years ago, and I have to tell you, I have never seen it used, so I'm not even going to cover it. It has to do with a lender requirement for a redisclosure. I've honestly never, ever, ever, ever seen it used. So, switching gears here. Can you guys see my 22 AR when I switch screens? Okay. Financing contingency notice. This is another one. A lot of these notices are confusing because they cover more than one thing and they just kind of throw them all on an addendum and you just pick the one that you want. So here's the notice to perform. Remember we talked about that at the end of day 21. On day 22, the seller can give that notice to perform under paragraph, I think it was 2A. Here's the form that goes with it. This is form 22AR, financing contingency notice. It's actually referenced in the financing addendum. And if you can't remember, you can always go to the manual. They're definitely going to call it out there. So this is where the seller would give the buyer notice to perform. And this is also where, remember that hatchet hanging over their head? This is where the seller would give a notice of termination. So they give a notice to perform, buyer has 3 days, buyer does nothing, doesn't waive. On day 4, the seller then can give a notice of termination and the buyer is out. There is no pleading your case. There is no going backwards and saying, no, I missed it. Oh, wait, I'll do it. Nope, you're done. You are done. So that one is very, very final. This is also the one, however, that the buyer would come back and within that 3 days and say, oh, okay, you know what? I'm really comfortable. I'm far enough along. I am going to go ahead and waive my financing. So you can see this form covers a lot of things. Notice from the seller, notice of termination, and then down at the bottom, the buyer's notice of waiver. So it's kind of a jack of all trades form. Increased down payment for low appraisal addendum. This is submitted with an offer. In this competitive environment, a lot of times people get crazy going over asking price on a property. And frankly, everybody knows that there's a good likelihood the property is not going to appraise, because what is an appraisal based on? An appraisal is only usually based on closed sales. I think of closed sales as a rear view mirror. These are things that happened in the past. And when we have properties appreciating at 1% and 2% a month, it can go under contract and not close for 3 months and appreciate while it's under contract. And yet we're looking at closed transactions from months ago, and there might not be a closed transaction to help validate the appraised value on the property or the sales price. Everybody knows that going in. So the buyer, by using this form, the 22AD, increased down payment for low appraisal, says right up front at the time of mutual acceptance, if we get a low appraisal, I am willing to contribute X number of dollars over whatever that low appraisal amount is. So you have a sales price of $500. The appraisal comes in at $470. The buyer has agreed to a $20,000 additional funds. So now instead of $470, you're up to $490. So now you only have a $10,000 difference to try and negotiate with the seller. And of course, the buyer has the option of paying that extra 10 if they want. But this is a guarantee or a reassurance to the seller in advance that the buyer is aware that if the appraisal comes in low, I'm willing to contribute more money towards the cause. Please, if you're in a multiple offer situation, you really need to be using this form if you possibly can. You just do. It's going to be a huge reassurance for the seller. And I've heard Kelly say in the past that if she gets an offer on a property that's over asking price, obviously you're only going to use this if you're going in over asking price, and it doesn't have a 22 AD, she won't even look at them. So know your forms, have your conversation with your buyers. So the increased down payment for low appraisal supersedes the appraisal less than sales price provision in the financing addendum. In other words, it trumps it. So here's the new rules. If the buyer's lender's appraisal comes in less than the purchase price, the buyer agrees to pay additional funds up to, this is the amount of money that they're going to pay over the low appraisal. Okay, $20,000 in my last example. These are buyer's additional funds towards their down payment. And the buyer's going to represent, yep, I got money in the bank to go ahead and pay that. So if the buyer becomes aware that the sum of the lender's appraisal, my example was 470, and the buyer's additional funds, my example was 20, is less than the purchase price of 500, we're at 490 and the purchase price was 500, then the buyer can deliver a written notice to the seller of that fact, including a copy of the lender's appraisal, which by the way is not just page 1, it's the whole thing, within 3 days. If buyer waives paragraph 5, appraisal less than sales price in the financing, buyer shall be obligated to purchase the property for the purchase price and may not give notice under that paragraph. What does that mean? So if the sales price was 480 and the appraisal came in at 470 and the buyer had agreed to the 20,000, it's only going to take it up to 480, but the buyer doesn't have the excuse of a low appraisal to get out of the contract anymore. It's taken away. This form trumps the low appraisal. So buyer's right to reduce price or seller's right to reduce price or terminate. If seller receives the above notice from the buyer, seller shall deliver notice reducing the purchase price, that was back to my gap, my 10,000, to an amount equal to the lender's appraised value plus the buyer's additional funds, or terminating. So in other words, that $10,000 gap that we had, if the seller doesn't agree to pay it, then here's, Tessa, help me here, because this is the one that has the teeth. Seller's right to reduce the price or terminate. So the seller only has 2 choices here. This is the one that I didn't want.
If the seller receives the notice. So before, back up to B, before the buyer was, which I guess it doesn't really matter, but the buyer was obligated to deliver notice. This
Right.
now says buyer may deliver notice, line 12. So if the
That
buyer
was
is
the word.
1,000 short,
Yep.
and the buyer says, you know what, don't even worry, because here's the thing: if you deliver that notice, then you put the power in the seller's hand. So you say, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, if you have the money to make up the difference, let's make up the difference. Because if you deliver that notice, then the seller's only choice, you're backing the seller into a corner. The seller's only choice is to reduce the price or terminate. And now the ball is not in the buyer's court.
Exactly. So the best practice for negotiating this, how do you go about it? Share it with us. So we've got a $10,000 gap. So we had an appraisal at 470. We got 20,000 that gets us to 490, and the sales price is 500. I got 10 grand to cover there. How do you do it?
Well, so I talked to my buyers first, and I let them know, hey, ideally do you have the money to make up the difference? And let's say they say, yeah, but we really don't want to. So I can pick up the phone and I can call the listing agent and say, hey, we're short, and have the conversation first before putting anything on paper. If they don't have any money, if this is all the money that they have, then we pick up the phone or we deliver the notice. But I'm always going to pick up the phone because I don't want to back the seller into a corner, right? And say, hey, we've done everything we can. This is literally all the money that they have. What do you guys think? Are you able to reduce the price? And if the seller's not willing to reduce the price, then your only option is for them to terminate because
Right.
the buyer can't perform.
Yep. Does that make sense? We were getting into kind of advanced financing there. Again, go back and read the manual. That's why I say this financing form, I have very experienced brokers who still have trouble connecting the dots. So go back and do your homework, you guys. Go back and study the manual, read through it, ask questions, talk to Kelly, talk to your whoever, and make sure that you understand the steps before you just start delivering all these notices, because they have ramifications. So increased down payment. So there's a disclosure that the buyer is using contingent funds, just like they have in the 22EF. Additional down payment. If buyer's appraised value is less than purchase price, buyer shall pay additional funds up to X towards the buyer's down payment to close the sale. Again, representing they have sufficient funds. Buyer may not terminate the agreement if buyer's appraised value and the additional funds are equal to or greater than the purchase price. That's kind of a no-brainer, right? Purchase price or appraisal at 470, purchase price at 480, and they put a $20,000 in there. Well, they've got more than enough to make up the difference. They can't come back and go, oh, the appraisal came in low, I want out. No, you've already pre-committed to the appraisal plus these additional funds. As long as the appraisal falls in that value range, you're going to go forward with the contract. This has to do with
So Lori, can I just,
and let me
yeah.
just finish
So
here. We're talking about a pure appraisal form, which you're probably rarely ever going to use. This is usually when you have, so an appraisal form is not part of the financing. An appraisal form is simply a standalone. An example would be you have a cash buyer moving here from Denver, buying $1 million house. They have $1 million in the bank. They don't need financing, but they're not familiar with the values in the area, and they want to have an appraisal done on the property, and they want that to be a contingency. So that's what they're talking about here with the Form 22AA. You're rarely going to use it. This is the one that you're going to use more often with the financing. Okay, Tessa, go ahead.
that's all I was going to say, is that you wouldn't use 1 and 2, you would use one or the other.
Right.
Like you would never have both of those filled out or checked.
Correct. So notice the low appraisal. There's the form. We went through that. Increased down payment for low appraisal. Here is our, here's our notices. So this goes with our 22AD. Now we've got a 22ADN, a 22AD notice form. See how this gets confusing? Buyer gives notice that the sum of the appraisal and the additional funds is blank, which is an amount less than the purchase price, and the seller's response is to consent or terminate. Here we go again. Notice of increased down payment for low appraisal addendum. So I'm trying to remember what this one is for. This is just for giving the notice, and then we go back. It's like the 35R. The 35R takes us through the steps, which is the response, but the timeframes are all spelled out on the 35. This is the notice, but all of the timeframes are spelled out on the financing addendum or the 22AD, the additional funds. This is just for the buyer's notice and the seller's notice. 90H, here's a standalone buyer's notice of waiver of financing contingency. It's pretty straightforward. It's one whole sentence. Buyer gives notice, but you need to know these forms are there. Another 90. So here's a little hint. Most of the 90s, as I call them, the forms in the 90s are purely notices. Notice of termination, notice of waiver, but they're notices and they're unilateral. They're just usually a single party notice, either the seller notifying the buyer or the buyer notifying the seller. It doesn't require 2 signatures. Most of the 90s are notices. So if you're looking for a notice, head for the 90s. There's a whole bunch of them. This is the buyer's notice of termination. Financing is unavailable. So instead of having to write something out on a blank form, buyers aren't able to get the financing, yada, yada, yada. There's a form for that. Go to your 90s. A lot of people don't know this is there. Limited waiver of financing contingency. So this is when you get served that notice to perform, but you've protected your buyer with the appraisal out. So they're waiving their financing, but they still have the protection of the appraisal. They don't want to give a full waiver of your financing in that 3-day period, but they're willing to waive just the financing but preserve the addendum, this is the form you use. Limited waiver. Waiver of the financing, but the appraisal less than sales price survives. Okay. And so buyer can't or seller can't terminate under paragraph 3 because the buyer still had the right to have the appraisal done. So seller serves the notice to perform, buyer comes back and says, yep, I'm willing to waive, but I'm not willing to waive my appraisal. And here's the form you use for that. Last form. I'm going to cover this again in the last 10 minutes because we covered it earlier, but you need to understand it now. Allison touched on it earlier when we were talking about this. And I want to make sure that everybody knows that under disclosure of contingent funds, right here, you have the ability to disclose the fact that your buyer is getting a loan. And it doesn't matter what kind of loan. They might be getting a HELOC on their primary. They might be getting a line of credit on their primary. They might be getting whatever, any kind of a loan. This is where you check it. Sale of the following owned, maybe they have another house to sell. Maybe they have a car to sell. Maybe they have a boat to sell. Maybe they have diamonds to sell. Maybe they have who knows what to sell. Their camper, their firstborn. This is where you would disclose that and just put a brief summary of what it is. Maybe they're getting a gift from grandma, which is very, very common. But I will also tell you that gifts from grandma, you'd think they're rock solid because grandmas rock and they wouldn't ever go back on their word. Well, guess what? Not all grandmas rocked, and they do go back on their word. So until that money is actually sitting in your borrower's bank account, there is no guarantee that grandma's going to loan that money. There just isn't. And so you have to disclose that you're receiving a gift. And until those funds, excuse me, are in your buyer's bank account, then they're contingent. They absolutely are contingent. Funds not readily convertible to liquid US funds. They've got a foreign stock account in London, whatever. I mean, I've heard it all. You will hear it all. And remember that it has to be US funds. So if you're dealing with a non-US client, these are documents from a financial institution in the United States. So if you have a Canadian client, as an example, or maybe a Chinese or Asian, whatever, if it is anywhere other than in the United States, your easiest option is to either get them to move the money to a United States bank account, have them open up an account here. They're going to need one anyway for wiring. Or if it's last minute, and I don't recommend this, but you certainly can strike the word United States and write in Canadian if you had to. If you've got a very wealthy Canadian client who's got money and they're not going to be able to open up their bank account until their next visit because of COVID, they can't get down here, yada, yada. But you want to make an offer right now, you can change that United States to Canadian. But what happens if you present evidence on Canadian bank account and it says right here from the United States? You have a gray area in the contract. I'm not saying it's void, but it may be voidable because you didn't perform under what you agreed to perform by. Woo! We covered a lot. I'm going to stop for air. I'm going to stop my sharing. Most confusing form ever. You're right, Laura Bird. This one has so many back and forth and if then what and what if the appraisal comes in low, but we've got an appraisal protection and but when do I terminate and how do I give a notice and what happens when? I just covered the 100-mile view, and you can tell as many times as I've been teaching this, I stumble on this form. The other one is the contingent sale form, and I don't know if we'll get to that or we might get to that at one in the future. But you need to actually sit down and connect all the dots if you have a client with a financing addendum and you have to give various notices. I want you to pull up those notices and get familiar with them. I want you to get familiar with the time frames. I want you to think of strategies if you're representing a buyer, how you can make an offer more attractive to a seller without jeopardizing your buyer's ability to go get their loan in place or whatever. There's a lot of things you can play with. Trust me. Most listing brokers are not going to catch it if you shorten up the time frame, say for loan application. So that's why it's so critical that you either in your video or in your email that you send over to the listing broker, you call things out, because it isn't going to do you any good to shorten up time frames and make it better for the seller if the seller doesn't even know, or the listing broker doesn't catch it and doesn't bother to explain it to the seller, and you lose out anyway. So not only do it, but explain. So do it and then tell them you did it. We talked a lot about best practices today, and I love having some of these more experienced brokers on here to share what they actually do in the field. This is gold. Anybody have anything? Head spinning? Tessa's video worked for my sale. There you go. You're learning from the best. So one of your homework assignments is to, if you haven't already, go shoot a practice video introducing yourself, pretending like you are working with a broker in Everett who doesn't know you from Adam or Susie or whoever, because I know we have an Adam Baldwin, but they don't know you. So shoot yourself a 60-second video. Don't make it long. Don't tell them about your firstborn and how you love to cook and drink wine and travel. They don't need to know all that crap, but they do need to know a little bit about you and a little bit about your buyer and a lot about your offer. Practice. You don't want to be practicing when you got a buyer sitting in front of you and you're getting ready to send off your first offer. Anybody? Kelly, Tessa, Julie, we've had a lot of contributions. Laura.
I'll say one last thing, Lori. On the example of your $10,000 apart, don't give up. You don't want to go show 15 more houses. Ask about grandmas. Ask if anyone has ever offered them money. Instruct them to say, why, yes, thank you. We will take your money, and swallow their pride.
Yes.
And also, there are those circumstances where grandma doesn't like the boyfriend you're buying a house with, and she won't give the money to your account, but you can put it in escrow. Talk to your lender about direct deposits of gift funds. Just don't give up. If you can get on a $10,000 gap, a $5,000 gift, talk to the agent. Hey, I'll split $2,500. Will the seller pay $2,500? What's your time worth to have to resell that buyer? So
Yeah,
we don't want to talk about commissionectomies like ever, but sometimes it's the most cost-effective way to get something done and to make.
Don't ever just give it up too easily, though. Make them.
No.
Yeah, definitely. But Julie's right. You know, and the flip side of that coin is, like I said earlier, the seller does not want to start over. Trust me, the seller wants to cross the finish line so they can get on with their life. So if you've got a good relationship with the listing broker, pick up the phone and just say, you know, here's where we're at. Julie's absolutely right, because when people come in and say we're 10,000 apart and we can't make it happen, that is my first thing that I tell you. Have you talked to your buyer about gift funds? Because Julie's also right that they're not going to want to ask grandma, but you know what? The reality is, if they do, grandma will usually come through, or mom or dad or somebody. Well, we didn't really want to ask them. You know what? The time has come. We're in crunch time. You're going to have to ask them. You're not going to say it that bluntly, but you're going to get them there. Okay. 9:59. Look at us rock stars. I know, heads are spinning. I see eyes glazing. Okay, Friday, we are going to start covering different points, different purchase and sale. We're going to go through multifamily, condo, and vacant land, I believe, is what we've got on the schedule for then. So go back, do your homework, download them, practice, shoot your video, and get ready. It's going to be, this year is supposed to be even better than last year. It is going to be a phenomenal year in the real estate business. So get prepared. Thank you, guys. Thank you all for coming.